Alright, and welcome back everybody to part 2. I said I'd try to keep it into one video, but once it hit 20 minutes, I was like, I don't know if I could go another 20 minutes straight. So, cut it there. We're starting part 2 here, just as a recap. I'm sure you went straight from that video to this video, so I don't need to recap that much. But we saw the aliens, the engineers come to Earth, seed life. Holloway and Shaw found out the solar system they wanted to go to. They took a ship with all the other crew members to get there. They finally got there. They found an engineer ship. They went in the ship. They found the head. They found some dead engineers. They found an ampule. They brought all that back. And here we are. All right, so we are now at the point where Fifield and Milburn are lost. Now, there's a little controversy around this. The first being, Fifield was the one who mapped the ship, so how could he be lost? I mean, he's a geologist, so I'll give it to him. Geologists aren't, the same as cartographers, but you were the kind of the guy who mapped the ship. How are you lost? He does call it out in the movie. He even says, "We're lost. Everything looks the same to me." And I will give it to him. If you've ever been on like a giant ship, like a giant cruise ship or something, that's a fraction of the size of these massive spaceships, and those are confusing. So there's a chance, but they do get lost, and they can't get back. And on the ship, on the Prometheus, they are now going to analyze the head. And Vickers is watching, and she straight up just says, "Are they all dead?" Because she just wants to get the heck out of there and doesn't want to have to deal with these engineers. But they don't know. And what they do is they take the helmet off the head. So for those of you wondering, in Alien, there's a guy who sits in a big chair. He's the same guy as these engineers, and that's how they tied these movies together. Pretty directly. I've heard people kind of say contrary, but it's quite direct. You'll even see the engineer in the chair at the end of this movie. And when they take the helmet off, they notice black pores on his head. And they actually ask, "What are those?" And they say, "They're cells in a state of change." And that's very important because what you'll learn is the black goo is like a biochemical weapon that changes the state of things, generally for the worse. But it's meant to manipulate. That's why it broke down the DNA of the engineer in the beginning. So you could tell this engineer is already infected, and they try to wake him up by stimulating the brain and see what happens, and he explodes. And the explosion is important because two reasons. One, David says, "Mortal after all," meaning these aren't gods. These are just other beings that made my creators, which is a big deal. And then second off, you could see it's green, just like the goo that was on the wall for David. So you can kind of put two and two together to see like that's what it was. All right, so David goes back, sneaky sneak, and he talks to Wayland through the special dream talking device. And he says, "What do you want me to do?" And Wayland says, "I want you to go and try harder and find those engineers for me." So there's a tuffle with Vickers and stuff in here, but I just skipped that. It's not as relevant. So then Shaw matches the DNA of the engineers to us, and it's a DNA match. Now they said 100% match, but I'm assuming it's one of those things with like humans and chimpanzees where it's like almost identical, but not exactly identical. Essentially saying we have the same DNA as the engineers, so they made us. And that all makes sense from the way the movie started. They seeded our planet. Nothing big there. So, now we start to get into the interesting point. Oh, hold on a second. I got a note here. Before the scene ends, Shaw asks, "What killed them?" Because what can kill them can kill us. So it's important to know. So then we kind of see David going through the ampule. There's a lot in here, but you'll be able to see the container black stuff. We'll just call it black container material. And the black goo is inside of these glass tubes, and you can see that's what it looks like. And interestingly enough, this is shaped almost like a warhead, so you can tell it's a weapon. And David, you can see the little Wayland stamp on his finger, which is kind of cool. David says, big things have small beginnings, which is a double meaning because one, it's from Lawrence in Arabia again, and two, he is putting together the pieces that this is what got out on the ship, and this is what creates death. So then he meets up with Holloway, who is a little drunk, a little depressed that they came all the way here and the engineers were gone. And David and him have a really good conversation. I think it's worth watching like the whole scene here and processing it, because David is asking, so David's an android, and that's really what makes the scene so special, is he's asking questions that you would expect a person to ask. So David says, we're going to celebrate, would you like a drink? And Holloway is sad because he wants to know why the engineers made him. And David said, why did you make me? And Holloway retorts, because we could. And David is smirking and saying, you know, imagine how disappointed you'd be to hear that same remark. And luckily for David, he cannot be disappointed. But it's just very interesting that an individual can feel so entitled to expect an answer for himself, but then doesn't care about another, right? So he's expecting his answer, why he's made, to be some great reason, but when they made David, who cares? So it's a very interesting play on words there, and I really like that conversation. And then David says, how far are you willing to go to get that answer? And Holloway says, as far as I have to go is whatever's needed. So David spikes his drink with the black goo. So David's he doesn't know how engineers are made. He doesn't know exactly what the black goo does, but he's got to start something. So he gives Holloway some black goo. So we're back to Fifield and Milburn, and they're up against a pile of dead engineers who look like they were running from something. And I believe I put 2 pictures in here, right? So this, I think, is actually an interesting, I'm going to call it an inconsistency. I think this is the only inconsistency in the movie that I could pick up. But Milburn says it looks like something broke out of them from their chest. So what he's implying is a chest burster from the Alien movies. And we do see that in this movie. But you're led to believe that all of these aliens died from the black goo itself, from almost like the plague-like aspect. So if there was a chest burster here and it popped out, it would have turned into, in this movie, it would have turned into a deacon, and that would have went around and killed things. So you can either take it 2 ways. One, that actually happened and it killed a lot of the life on this planet, which is why the planet looks desolate. Or 2, it didn't, and they just threw that in there, and that was just a mistake. But I have to point that out for sure. So then we go back, and we're looking at Shaw, and she essentially says, I'm trying to understand what happened here. Was it a biological outbreak? Again, going towards that direction. And then we learn a bit about Holloway and Shaw. This is like more of a love scene, but Shaw is sterile and cannot have kids. And Holloway essentially says, you know, anybody can make life, but she can't. And so she takes offense to that. They have a great conversation around it. And they end up being intimate in this scene. And that's important because Holloway was just infected with the black goo. So he's now going to transmit that to Shaw. So then we go back to Milburn and Fifield. And there's a lot here. Let me see which pictures I have here. So they go back to the ampule room with the big head, and those little earthworms turned into these 2 hammerpedes, and you can kind of see them in the picture. And this is another point of contention in the movie, which, you know, I could see where people are coming from. So Milburn decides to try to calm these hammerpedes, we'll call them. But essentially, he calls back to the Prometheus and says, we have these 6 feet long alien species, and they're beautiful. And he says they're beautiful because he's a biologist and he's not scared. He feels like he's in his element. And he's got his buddy Fifield, the cool kid on the bus behind him, like trembling. So he wants to show Fifield, how big of a man he is, like how this is his domain. He could actually contribute. So he tries to tame it, but unfortunately it grabs his arm and it breaks his arm, and they try to cut it off, but the acid sprays onto Fifield's helmet and he goes straight into the black, we'll say black, what do we call it? Black container liquid on the ground, mixed with some black goo because some of the ampules have been opened. Then, and the other one went into Milburn's throat. Then the next day, we see Holloway have a little alien thing coming out of his eye, so he knows something bad is going to happen. And now they're going to go on a rescue mission, back out to save Milburn and Fifield, who have been gone for the night. They haven't heard from him. Let me see if there's anything in here. Oh, that's right. So I'll just skip to it. So they're all getting on the ship, and there's a malfunctioning probe on the ship, they say. One of those glowy ones. And David says, I'll fix it for you. The probe is saying that there's life every hour. It beeps, says there's something here, and then it goes away. And that's essentially the engineer in hypersleep. Or cryosleep, I guess they call it here. And David also shoots a quick jab at Holloway here. He says, careful, doctors, because he knows that Holloway's going to get sick because he poisoned him. So now David is going on the ship by himself to go, quote-unquote, fix the probe. And Vickers says, hey, let me see your data feed, because she wants to spy on what David's doing. David finds the probe, and it's stuck at a door. So David opens the door, and he finds the armory. Now, this is all the bombs, all the ampules. So these are essentially bombs. And this is their armory on their battleship here. He cuts Vickers' feed off because David works for Wayland, not for Vickers. And that is a sneaky guy. While this is happening, they find Milburn dead. And I didn't include it, but they also have Holloway sick. Right, he's getting sicker and sicker. They got to get him out of there. David, on the other hand, gets to the control room of the ship. The hypersleep chambers are there. Navigational computers here. And he turns on the black box for this room, the recording device for this room. And he learns how to pilot the ship with a flute and some buttons. And he also learns how the engineers were planning. And I kept this scene in because you can see there's multiple engineers talking in this scene about what to do. And they pull up all the different solar systems that they have influence over or have seeded. And they're like, which one are we going to go to? What's going on? And then they pick our solar system, which is Saturn and Jupiter, and then you'll see Earth later on. And that's the planet they planned on going to. And now remember, this was carbon dated 2,000 years ago. So they were going to go 2,000 years ago and potentially use this warship and wipe out all of Earth. David double checks and he finds out there is a live engineer. So they get back to the ship without David. And Holloway is so sick. Vickers says, I'm not letting that sick guy on my ship. So she burns him. He tries to get on the ship and she burns him. Now, during that scene, it's pretty traumatizing. Shaw essentially passes out. They don't tell you exactly what happens, but she's from exhaustion or whatever the case is, from stress. And she wakes up in the lab. This is the same lab that they were doing the head in. It's not like a med lab, like a med bay. And you could see she's got her cross on, and David goes to take the cross off and says, I have to, because you initiated quarantine protocol, I need to take your cross off, check if it's contaminated. And she says, yeah, make sure you check everyone else. But David knows he's not going to check everyone else because he knows how Holloway got sick. And he then asks if Holloway and Shaw were intimate because Shaw is pregnant. So even though she was sterile, she's now pregnant. And that's kind of a little, again, another play on the religion, you know. But the fetus is not a typical fetus. She's 3 months pregnant. So David knows that there's some organism in her that's definitely something Wayland wants. So he says to her, you know, the best thing for us to do is to just put you into cryosleep until we get you home. So he pretty much tricks her, puts her in the cryosleep, and when they're trying to move her, she wakes up and just fights her way out. And she's on the move with this alien inside of her. And she goes to the machine in Vickers's lifeboat, I think they call it, special pod, that can do any surgery. And she says cesarean, which is, you know, for a child. And the life pod says this is only for male operations, which lets you know that this was actually Wayland's life pod. So Wayland is on the ship, and that's how you find out Wayland's on the ship. She has the alien removed from her. It's pretty gross. And sterilized. So she escapes. They also find out that Fifield's body is outside the ship. It crawled up there. And Fifield was the one whose head went right into the goo. And he just became a monster and started killing people. And they shot him down and burned him, unfortunately. That's the way the cookie crumbles with some of these guys. So now Shaw, with the monster out, stumbles into Wayland. And she's like, what the heck is going on here? Wayland's on the ship. David's so calm. What's going on? I kept this scene because David, for the first time in the movie, is confused. So David is a very smart character, but he's trying to understand how could someone like Shaw survive. And this is the turning point for David and Shaw's relationship, which builds into Alien Covenant, where she earns his respect through surviving that. And then they essentially have a conversation with Wayland. And if you guys are wondering why Wayland looks like this, I think this is Guy Pearce. They actually had a whole intro part of the movie in the deleted scenes, but not in the movie. It's not required, showing what Wayland was like when he was younger. So they cast a young guy, and they gave him old makeup rather than casting an old guy. So David tells Shaw, we're going to find that live engineer. And Shaw's like, I can't believe you came. I can't believe there's an engineer alive. And she said, why did you come? And Wayland says, I came because if they made me, they could save me from death. And so Shaw suits up herself because she wants to go ask the questions to the engineer. She essentially wants to know, why do they want to kill her? And Yannick says, hey, listen up. We know this is a military installation. They're carrying death. They're smart. They put their warships on a planet like this, not at their home planet. And obviously some of this stuff got out and killed them all. So that stuff can definitely not come back home. And he says, I'm just the captain, but I promise you, none of this stuff is going to come home. So before they go, Vickers talks to Wayland, and you find out that Vickers is actually his daughter in this scene. But she says a king has his reign, and then he dies. And that's important because he will die, and death is inevitable, essentially, in this movie. It's a theme. And he's surprised that Vickers came, because Vickers wanted to... You'll see the relationship with the father and Vickers, but it's sort of a love-hate. She hates him for how he shuns her, but she also doesn't want to miss out on what could happen. So I kept this in just because Shaw talks to David before they go to the alien ship again, the engineer ship again, and Shaw says, what are you going to do when Wayland dies? He's almost dead. And David says, I don't know. And she says, well, you'll be free. Don't you want to be free? And he said, I'm an android. I don't have any wants. And he said, but I guess I'd enjoy it because everybody wants their parents dead. And Shaw's like, except for me. And they get into the ship, and David says, take off your helmets. You can breathe in here. And Shaw says, watch out. Holloway got sick from the air. It could be contaminated. Keep your helmets on. And David says, it wasn't from the air. And Shaw says, how do you know? And he never replies. So that's David essentially admitting he killed Holloway, which is a big deal. Then Shaw shows Yannick the armory. And they both decide this is a warship. We can't let it free. And this is Yannick discovering with the topography that it is in fact a warship. David shows them the navigational chamber room and the fancy hypersleep chambers, and he uses the flute to power on the ship. And then David talks to Shaw and says, they were planning on coming to Earth, and then something happens. And she said, well, why would they go to Earth? And David says, sometimes to create, you must destroy. So David is clever enough to understand that the weapon that these engineers carry is a weapon of destruction and creation. And you can use it to reset life, so to destroy life, and you can use it to seed life. And if your creation gets out of control, you might want to destroy it and reseed it. So David wakes up the engineer so they can talk to him. And Shaw keeps yelling, essentially saying, where are you guys from? Why did you want to kill us? And they just knock her away. And so Shaw says to David, tell him why I'm here. Now, there are some deleted scenes around here, worth watching, not needed. But essentially they say, David saying, we came here, we are your creations. Can you help us defeat death? And the engineer looks at David and looks at Wayland and thinks, who is this? Why is my creation's creation talking to me? So what he created is so low below him, and then whatever they made is talking to him is an insult. So he immediately kills David by ripping his head off, and kills Wayland by hitting him with David's head. This is kind of a blurry scene, but yeah, they shoot the engineer, and he kills everybody else in there except for Shaw, who escapes. And in this scene, Wayland says, there is nothing, and David says, I know. And they're referencing the quote David made from Lawrence of Arabia, in the desert there is nothing. So this is a nice way to tie that up to essentially say, they went to go seek something, but it's a desert, and that desert had nothing to seek. So very interesting. The engineer sets a course for Earth. I kept this scene in just because one of the most common questions I got asked was, are these engineers the same guys from Aliens? It's like, yeah, they are. These are the flight suits that they use, and this is what it looks like in the Alien movie. So they're like kind of in the cockpit here. So Yannick says, we got to get out of here, jettisons the lifeboat, jettisons Vickers, and on the planet they have Vickers and they have Shaw, because Shaw escaped, and on the ship they have just the rest of the crew, just a few guys left. And Yannick decides, we have no weapons, we got to just kamikaze in, so they crash into the engineer ship and destroy it. And then the ship lands on the planet and it kills Vickers. So Vickers is dead too. So all that's left is Shaw and David. So Shaw gets up. David talks to her over the communication device and says, the engineer is still alive. He's coming to get you. So Shaw runs to the lifeboat, and she tricks the engineer to go near the door where the squid was that was inside of her. But now it's been so long, the squid grew into this giant squid. And this giant squid is like a face hugger. And it grabbed onto the engineer, and it put a chest burster inside of the engineer. And Shaw then goes back to David to get her necklace, and he asks again after all this time, do you still believe? Why do you believe? And she says, of course, I still believe. And he says, you know there's other ships here. I could take you home. And she says, I don't want to go home. I want to go to where they came from. And you can see them going to the other ship here. And then at the very end, you can see the deacon come out of the engineer. So overall, that was the whole plot of the movie. I tried to summarize and get all the points across that I could. There was a lot. I didn't want to talk for this long. I thought it was going to be way faster. But this is one of my favorite movies. I think there's a lot in this movie. It ties directly into Alien Covenant, though that went a different direction. And the core portion of this movie that makes it really a good thinking movie is it's about understanding where you came from. And even when that answer is not satisfactory, what would you do? And it's interesting because in the same movie, you have people like us who want to know how we were made. But at the same time, we've made things on our own, and we think it's silly when they question why they were made. So I think it's just a very, very, very good movie for that point. And also, if you have the chance, watch the beginning of Alien Covenant. There's an intro about David. It's really great. Sheds a lot of insight into that character. I think that character was amazing in this movie as well. Like I said, there's a lot of nuances. Having androids do their hair to be like a character from a movie in and of itself is interesting because David knows that's just a character in a movie, but he still relates. David's quoting movies. And I guess if you didn't see that movie, it is a little harder to follow. But yes, it's very interesting. So if you guys like this, add a comment below if I missed anything. Feel free to, like button, subscribe. These were 2 very long videos, I guess almost an hour together, 45 minutes to an hour. I might do more of these. I got to figure out a way to make them faster. So if there's any suggestions, let me know. The only problem is there's a lot of scenes in these movies that you don't want to miss. And I'm not sure. So I skipped a bunch of stuff. But I skipped stuff that I felt you could either pick up on your own or wasn't as relevant as the stuff that we covered here. So overall, hope everybody enjoys it and look forward to hearing your comments and seeing your suggestions.